At 5 years old, my father left, remarrying shortly after. I was raised by my grandmother, and later, when my stepmother learned about my inheritance, she tried to take it all, but I responded firmly. My first memory of my father is him leaving when I was 5, holding on to my favorite teddy bear, watching as he packed his things and walked away without looking back. I stood there, tiny and heartbroken, with my grandmother's comforting hand on my shoulder. I kept thinking that I must have done something terribly wrong to make him leave. Later, I was told he had left to start a new life with his new wife, Sophia. I couldn't understand what that meant back then. All I knew was that he was gone and wasn't coming back. Grandma tried to explain it to me, but there's only so much a child can understand. I grew up feeling as though a part of me was missing, something my father had taken with him when he decided to leave. My grandmother was my rock, accepting me without a second thought, raising me in a grand, sprawling home that had belonged to our family for generations. It had high ceilings, graceful chandeliers, and lush gardens where I spent many afternoons exploring. To me, it was more than a home. It was an entire world, a place of refuge where I felt safe from the pain of being abandoned. As I got older, Grandma would tell me stories of our family's legacy, tales of wealth, strength, and ancestors who had built fortunes and earned respect. There were portraits all over the walls, paintings of stern-faced men and women whose eyes seemed to follow me wherever I went. Grandma would point at them and say, "These are your roots, Ava. This is where you come from." I'd nod, feeling a blend of pride and responsibility, though I was too young to understand the full weight of it. But there was one story Grandma didn't share until I was much older. When I was in my late teens, almost an adult, she brought me to the drawing room one evening, where the scent of old books and faded memories filled the air, and told me about the money my mother had left me. I saw the strain on her face as she spoke, the worry lines deepening. "Your mother wanted to make sure you'd be taken care of," she said, her voice gentle but resolute. "She left you a significant sum. When you turn 21, it will all be yours." The news overwhelmed me like a wave. I'd known we were well off, but realizing a part of my mother's legacy had been saved for me felt almost unreal, like finding a hidden treasure, a final gift from a mother I barely remembered, but whose presence had always lingered in the background of my life. From that point on, I became more aware of the subtle changes in the atmosphere around me. My stepmother, Sophia, started showing a keener interest in my life. She would visit on occasion, always with a polite smile, but her questions seemed to probe too deeply. She'd ask about my plans, my studies, and even my friendships. At first it seemed harmless enough, but there was an underlying sharpness to her curiosity that I couldn't quite identify. Then, one summer afternoon, during a rare visit from both my father and Sophia, the pieces started to fit together. They had come for tea, and as always, it was a tense and awkward affair. My father seemed like a shadow of the man I once knew, while Sophia took center stage, asking question after question, her gaze fixed on me. "So, Ava," she said, stirring her tea slowly, "I hear you'll be quite well off soon. Your grandmother mentioned an inheritance." Her words were like a knife slicing through the subdued murmur of polite conversation. I felt Grandma tense beside me, her hand gripping her cup tightly. Sophia's tone was light and casual, but her eyes had a calculating glint, watching my reaction carefully. I nodded slowly, choosing my words with caution. "Yes, that's what I've been told," she responded with a tight, cold smile that didn't reach her eyes. "Well, it's good to know you'll be taken care of. Family wealth is precious. It should remain within the family, don't you think?" I glanced at my father, hoping for some sign of support, but he just stared into his tea, either lost in thought or avoiding the conversation. It was as though he'd resigned himself to the sidelines, allowing Sophia to take charge. That afternoon marked a turning point. Sophia's words lingered, a subtle warning that more was at stake than I'd realized. I started paying closer attention to her behavior, the way her gaze lingered on the family portraits, and how her questions always circled back to the inheritance, the family wealth. I began wondering if her interest in me had ever been genuine, or if it was simply a calculated move to secure her place in the family's legacy. The thought gnawed at me, filling me with unease. I could sense my grandmother was protecting me, shielding me from the worst of it, but I also saw the toll it was taking on her. I noticed the way she watched Sophia, her eyes sharp and wary, as if she could see right through the facade my stepmother had crafted so carefully. Despite the tension, I found solace in Grandma's stories. she would share tales of our ancestors, the challenges they overcame, the fortunes they amassed, the legacies they left behind. She made me feel part of something larger than myself, connected to a long line of resilience and strength. I clung to those stories, drawing strength from them as I sensed the world around me shifting, the foundation of my life gradually crumbling under the weight of hidden secrets and lies. The more I learned about my inheritance, the more I understood the precarious position I was in. I was a young woman with a substantial fortune on the horizon, surrounded by people with their own agendas and desires. I began to realize that my father's abandonment was only the start of a far bigger story, one that was still playing out, where I was not only the main character but also the prize. Through it all, my grandmother remained my constant, the one person I could depend on. She taught me how to handle the complicated dynamics within our family, how to see beyond appearances, and how to guard myself against those who might try to exploit me. Yet, despite her guidance, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was standing on the edge of a precipice, barely keeping my balance over something dark and treacherous. As years passed, Sophia's interest in my inheritance became less hidden. During her visits, she would make subtle remarks about family unity and hint at how I would need support and advice when it came time to manage my wealth. She often looked at my father, as though willing him to exert some influence over me, but he stayed distant, detached, watching the unfolding situation without involvement. I grew more wary, more guarded, feeling the pressure rise and the tension simmering under the surface. I knew Sophia was planning something, waiting for the right moment to act, and I knew I had to be prepared. The memory of my father's departure haunted me, a constant reminder of the fragility of family bonds and how easily love could be replaced by greed and ambition. I had spent my life trying to fill the emptiness he had left behind, trying to make sense of a world he had shattered by leaving. Now, as I stood on the brink of inheriting a fortune, I realized I was alone in this fight and could trust no one but myself. As the day of my inheritance neared, I sensed a storm gathering, forces aligning against me. I was caught in a struggle I hadn't chosen, a battle for control, for power, for the legacy my mother had left. Although I was frightened, I knew I had to confront it directly and defend what was rightfully mine. For the first time, I felt a spark of defiance, a glimpse of strength that had been hidden under years of fear and self-doubt. I would not be a pawn in their scheme. I would not be manipulated, not by Sophia, not by my father, not by anyone. This was my life, my inheritance, my legacy, and I was ready to fight for it. I had been expecting this moment, but Sophia's approach still surprised me. She arrived unannounced one afternoon, sweeping into the house with a sense of authority, as though she owned it. The air around her seemed charged, her every movement filled with purpose. I had anticipated her making a move, but hadn't expected it to be so direct, so bold. She wasted no time with formalities. We stood in the drawing room, the same room where my grandmother had once told me about the inheritance that would one day be mine. Light filtered through the tall windows, casting long shadows, and I felt the weight of my ancestors watching over me, their portraits lined up like silent witnesses. Ava, Sophia began, her voice cold and steady. I think it's time we had an honest conversation about the family finances. I crossed my arms, meeting her gaze with a defiance I hadn't known I possessed. I'm listening, she smiled, but it was a calculated smile that didn't reach her eyes. As you know, your father and I have worked hard to preserve the family's wealth. It hasn't been easy, especially with the burdens he has carried since your mother's passing. Mentioning my mother was a calculated move, and I felt a surge of anger. Go on. She took a step closer, her gaze narrowing as she continued. Your father has debts, Ava, significant ones. I don't expect you to understand financial complexities, but the fact is, he needs help, and as a family, we should be willing to support each other. The implication was clear. She was asking, or rather demanding, my inheritance. Barely containing my anger, I replied, you're asking me to give up what my mother left me? That money isn't yours, and it isn't my father's. It's mine. Sophia's expression hardened, and I caught a glimmer of frustration in her eyes. That money belongs to the family, Ava. It's not just about you. Your father has worked tirelessly to provide for you, and this is how you repay him, by refusing to help when he needs it most. Her words were sharp, piercing, but I stood my ground. No, this is about your desire for control. You've had your eye on that inheritance for years. Don't pretend this is about loyalty or family duty. It's about your greed. Sophia's face contorted with anger, her polite mask slipping away. You ungrateful child, she spat. You have no idea what it takes to keep a family like this together. Your father deserves that money more than you. Do you think you've earned it? Do you feel entitled just because your mother left it to you? Her words stung, but I held firm. My mother wanted me to have it, and I'm not letting you manipulate me into giving it up for a moment. Sophia just stared at me, her gaze cold and calculating. Then, without another word, she turned and walked out of the room, her footsteps echoing down the empty hallways. I felt a mix of relief and dread, knowing this wasn't over, and that she wouldn't surrender so easily. The days that followed were tense. I knew that Sophia was scheming, unwilling to let go of her ambitions so soon. Before long, the full extent of her plans became clear. One morning, I received a letter from her lawyer. It was a formal, intimidating document full of legal terms that I struggled to comprehend, but the message was unmistakable. Sophia was challenging my claim to the inheritance, arguing that my father had a right to the funds due to family debts and obligations. She was trying to seize my legacy through legal means, threatening to drag me into a prolonged court battle if I didn't comply. As I read the letter, I felt the color drain from my face, the weight of it pressing down on me like a stone. How had it come to this? How had my life turned into a legal fight over money that rightfully belonged to me, leaving me desperate for guidance? I turned to my grandmother, the one person who had always stood by me and protected me. I found her in the garden, carefully pruning the roses, her expression calm and serene. But when I handed her the letter, her calmness faded, replaced by a steely resolve I hadn't seen in years. "We won't let her win," she said firmly, her hands steady as she held the letter. "This is your legacy, Ava. Your mother wanted you to have it, and neither Sophia nor your father has any right to take it from you." Her words soothed my spirit, though worry still lingered. "She's going to try everything, Grandma. She won't stop until she gets what she wants." My grandmother placed a reassuring hand on my shoulder. "Then we'll fight her," she replied with resolve. "We'll fight her with everything we have." Over the following days, Sophia's methods grew harsher. She began spreading rumors, hinting that I was selfish and unwilling to support my father in his time of need. She would arrive at the house unexpectedly, making pointed comments about loyalty and family values, attempting to guilt-trip me into compliance. The most painful part was the effect it had on my relationship with my father. He had always been distant, but under Sophia's influence, he became even more withdrawn. When I tried to talk to him, to share my side, he would brush me off, his gaze filled with a mix of frustration and disappointment. "Ava," he said one evening, his voice heavy with resignation, "you need to think about what's best for the family. This inheritance isn't just about you, it's about all of us." His words felt like a betrayal, stinging deeply. "Do you even care about what my mother wanted? This money isn't yours, Dad, it's mine. She left it for me, not for you, and certainly not for Sophia." He looked away, his expression unreadable. "Sophia has done more for this family than you realize. She's been a constant presence, there for me when I needed her most. She's right, this money could help us all. You're too young to understand the burdens we face." The argument escalated, with both of us saying things we could never take back. In that moment, I saw how deeply Sophia had driven a wedge between us, twisting the situation to turn my father against me. I could see the conflict in his eyes, torn between loyalty to Sophia and his duty to me, but I couldn't give in. I wouldn't. This inheritance was more than just money. It was a symbol of my mother's love, a piece of her left behind for me, and I wasn't going to let anyone take that from me. As weeks passed, Sophia's pressure only intensified. She involved her lawyer more directly, sending an endless stream of letters and legal documents. I felt overwhelmed, buried under a mountain of demands and threats that left me exhausted and demoralized. One evening, I sat with my grandmother, going through the latest stack of papers. She looked at me with both sadness and determination. "Ava," she said softly, "you have to be strong. I know this is difficult, but you're not alone. I'm here, and we'll get through this together." Her words gave me strength, but I could feel the strain weighing on me. I had never wanted to be part of such a battle, nor had I imagined defending my mother's legacy against my own family. Yet, I was learning, slowly but surely, how to push back. I started seeking advice from family friends, people who had known my mother and who understood the complex nature of our family's wealth. I learned about trusts, legal protections, and ways to safeguard my inheritance from those who might attempt to exploit it. With each new piece of knowledge, I felt a little more empowered, a bit more prepared to face whatever Sophia might try next. Yet, the sense of betrayal never faded. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was losing something more precious than money. I was losing my family, the connection to my father that I had held on to even after he left. I was losing the illusion of loyalty, the hope that somehow we could weather this storm together. As tensions between Sophia and me reached a boiling point, I realized that this fight wasn't only about the inheritance, it was about asserting my independence, my control, and standing up for myself in the face of manipulation and greed. Despite the pain, I knew I had to see it through to the end. The legal threats, the veiled accusations, the coldness from my father, everything was part of a game I'd been forced into, a game I couldn't avoid. But I was ready. I was prepared to fight for what was mine, to protect the legacy my mother had entrusted to me. No matter what Sophia did or how hard she tried to undermine me, I wouldn't back down. I had my grandmother's support and a strength that came from knowing I was fighting for something bigger than myself. This was my life, my future, and I was determined to hold on to it, no matter the cost. Sophia's intentions were clear, and I knew I couldn't simply wait for her next move. She had already managed to turn my father against me and had begun using legal threats to control me. I needed to expose her for who she truly was. This was no longer about merely protecting my inheritance, it was about uncovering the truth. I began my search in the most obvious place, Sophia's past. She had always been reserved about her life before marrying my father, but I remembered bits she had let slip at family gatherings, stories about living in various cities and mentions of ex-husbands that were swiftly brushed off. My grandmother had always looked skeptical when Sophia mentioned her past, but I hadn't paid much attention then. Now, those stories seemed less like passing remarks and more like pieces of a puzzle I needed to solve. I started with public records, digging up anything I could find about her previous marriages. It was a tedious process, but worthwhile. Soon, a pattern emerged. I discovered records of 3 former marriages, each ending suddenly, leaving each husband in financial ruin. One man had filed for bankruptcy, another had lost his family business, and a third reportedly lost a significant portion of his savings before the marriage ended. The findings were chilling. Each of Sophia's marriages had ended in financial ruin, with her leaving unscathed every single time. The more I discovered, the more certain I became that this was no coincidence. She wasn't just after wealth, she was a practiced con artist. I knew that confronting her openly wasn't an option. She was too shrewd, too skilled at twisting things to her advantage. I needed leverage, something I could use to safeguard myself and open my father's eyes to the truth. I needed someone experienced, someone who knew her type and could help me dig deeper to build a case. That's when I thought of Mr. Bennett. Mr. Bennett was an old friend of my mother's, a retired lawyer who had been close to our family for many years. He had always been there quietly in the background, offering support when needed. I remembered him at my mother's funeral, his voice breaking with emotion as he shared memories of their friendship. If anyone could help me now, it would be him. I reached out and explained everything: Sophia's demands, the legal threats, and the troubling details I'd uncovered about her past. He listened intently, his expression growing graver as I continued. When I finished, he nodded with determination. "Your mother was a dear friend, Ava," he said firmly. "If Sophia is as you say, then we have to stop her. Let's see what we can uncover together." We began investigating Sophia's activities. Mr. Bennett had access to resources and legal contacts beyond anything I could manage on my own, and he soon unearthed documents that painted an even darker picture than I had expected. Sophia had been quietly transferring family assets into accounts under her name, siphoning funds away, likely preparing for a quick departure once she had drained everything she could. One evening, as we went through the documents in Mr. Bennett's study, he handed me a thick folder full of records, bank statements, and letters. I skimmed through them, each page confirming my worst fears. Sophia had been plotting this for months, maybe even years. She had used my father, won his trust, and then systematically drained him of resources. "We have enough here to confront her," Mr. Bennett said, his tone low but resolute. "Your father needs to see this. He has to know what she's been doing." My heart sank at the thought. I knew he wouldn't believe me. Sophia had so thoroughly poisoned our relationship that he barely looked at me, let alone listen to anything I had to say. But I knew I had to try. I couldn't let her keep manipulating him, taking advantage of him under the guise of love and loyalty. I arranged to meet my father at a quiet cafe, far from prying eyes and ears. From the moment he arrived, I could tell he didn't want to be there. He barely glanced at me, his gaze fixed somewhere beyond me as he sat down, his posture stiff and guarded. "I need to talk to you about Sophia," I began, struggling to keep my voice steady. "There are things you don't know about her." "I've been looking into," he cut me off, his face hardening. "I don't want to hear it, Ava. You've made your feelings about her perfectly clear, but you're letting resentment cloud your judgment. Sophia has done nothing but try to help this family." "She's lying to you," I insisted, my desperation growing. "She's been moving assets, stealing from you." "I have proof." He shook his head, his expression a mix of anger and disappointment. "I don't believe you. You've never accepted her, never given her a chance. She's your stepmother, Ava. She's family, and I won't stand here and listen to you slander her." His words cut like a knife. I had expected resistance, but not this level of betrayal. He was so fully under Sophia's influence that he couldn't see the truth, even when it was right in front of him. Taking a deep breath, I forced myself to stay calm. "Please just look at the documents. Mr. Bennett and I found evidence, bank statements, transfers, everything. If you just look, you'll see she's been deceiving you." But he refused to even glance at the files I held out to him. He simply stood, his face set in cold indifference. "I don't need to see anything," he said quietly. "If you want to pursue this, that's your choice, but don't expect my support." With that, he walked away, leaving me standing there, feeling the weight of his betrayal pressing down like a physical force. I had always known my father was weak, easily swayed by others, but this was beyond anything I'd imagined. He had chosen Sophia over me, over the truth. Heartbroken but more resolved than ever, I returned to Mr. Bennett. He was waiting, his face somber but determined. "I take it he didn't believe you," he said, reading my expression. I nodded, holding back tears. "He's completely under her control. He won't listen to me at all." Mr. Bennett sighed, placing a comforting hand on my shoulder. "Then we'll have to go public. We have enough evidence to expose her, to force her to back down. But it won't be easy. She's clever, and she'll fight back." I met his gaze, feeling a surprising strength in my voice. "I'm ready. I won't let her take everything: my inheritance, my family's legacy, my life." In the days that followed, Mr. Bennett and I worked tirelessly to build our case. We compiled every piece of evidence, creating a comprehensive file that detailed Sophia's deceptions, her history of manipulation, and her pattern of financial exploitation. It was exhausting work, but with each new discovery, I felt more empowered. I was no longer a pawn in Sophia's game. I was taking control of my life, standing up for what was mine. We brought our case to the family's financial advisor, a man who had worked with my grandmother for years and respected our family's legacy deeply. He was shocked by the evidence but promised his support, agreeing to help us reveal the truth about Sophia. As we prepared to confront her, I felt an unusual sense of calm. I realized this battle wasn't just about safeguarding my inheritance. It was about standing up for myself, about proving to everyone, including my father, that I was strong enough to face whatever lay ahead. The confrontation was approaching, and I felt prepared. Sophia had underestimated me, just as she had underestimated the strength of the legacy my mother had left behind. She thought she could maneuver her way into my family's wealth, but she was about to find out how wrong she was. I wasn't going to let her steal my future. I was ready to fight and to win. The day of the confrontation finally came. Mr. Bennett and I had invested countless hours preparing, gathering every piece of evidence, every document, and every revealing detail of Sophia's hidden past. I felt a mix of nerves and resolve, but as I stood outside my father's study, I knew there was no going back. This was my opportunity to reclaim my future and safeguard my family's legacy. My father was already inside, looking tense. I had urged him to meet with me and Mr. Bennett, insisting on the importance. I saw the uncertainty and unease in his eyes as he glanced between us. He still didn't grasp the magnitude of what was about to unfold, but he was about to. Sophia entered moments later, her expression guarded but confident. She had no idea what was coming, and for an instant, I almost felt a flicker of pity. But then I remembered every lie, every manipulation, and every attempt to take what was mine, and any sympathy disappeared. "Ava, "What's this all about?" my father asked, his voice a mix of impatience and concern. "Why did we have to meet like this?" I took a deep breath to steady myself. "Dad, you need to know the truth about Sophia. I've discovered things you have to see." Sophia's eyes narrowed, a flash of irritation crossing her face. "What are you talking about, Eva?" "This is absurd," I ignored her, handing my father the stack of documents that Mr. Bennett and I had compiled. I watched him scan the pages, his eyes widening as he absorbed each piece of evidence: bank records showing unauthorized transfers, correspondence revealing secret accounts, and records of her prior marriages and the financial devastation left in each. His hands trembled as he turned the pages, his face growing paler with each revelation. "Sophia, what is this?" he asked, looking up with a mixture of shock and hurt. Sophia's composure cracked, if only briefly, before she regained her usual poise, shaking her head as if brushing it all aside. "It's nothing, John. These are just misunderstandings, taken out of context. Ava's trying to ruin me, trying to drive us apart." I asked, stepping forward. "Is this all just a misunderstanding? Because it looks very clear to me that you've been moving family assets, taking from Dad just like you did with your other husbands. I have the records, Sophia, you can't deny it." Sophia's confident mask began to slip as she saw the extent of the trap we had set. She glanced at Mr. Bennett, her gaze narrowing. "You were in on this too?" Mr. Bennett didn't waver. "I'm here to protect Ava's interests. Your deceitful actions left us no choice." My father turned back to Sophia, betrayal and disbelief etched deeply into his face. "Is it true, Sophia? After all these years, have you really been lying to me?" Sophia's bravado crumbled, and she struggled to speak, but no words came. The weight of the evidence was too overwhelming, and I saw the panic rising in her eyes. She knew she was trapped. "This wasn't how it was supposed to be," she murmured, her voice barely audible. "I was trying to protect us, John. I did what I had to protect us," I echoed, my voice sharp. "You were protecting yourself. You didn't care about Dad, about our family, or anyone but yourself. You're nothing but a fraud, and now everyone knows it." The room fell silent as Sophia finally lowered her gaze, defeated. My father's face crumpled as he took in the truth, absorbing the betrayal. He looked at Sophia as if seeing her for the first time, a stranger. In that moment I realized how much he, too, had lost. He had been deceived, manipulated by someone he trusted. "Get out," he said quietly but firmly. "I want you out of this house, now." Sophia's eyes flashed with anger, but she knew she had no choice. She turned and left, her footsteps echoing down the hall as she exited our lives. As the door closed behind her, I felt a strange mix of relief and sadness. The battle was over, but the scars remained. My father sank into a chair, his head in his hands, and I could feel the weight of his sorrow as he realized the depth of his deception. I wanted to reach out and comfort him, but I didn't know how. We had both been hurt, both betrayed, and the path to healing seemed long and uncertain. "I'm sorry," he whispered finally, looking up at me with eyes red and filled with remorse. "I should have believed you. I should have seen it sooner." I sat down beside him, placing a hand on his shoulder. "It's not your fault, Dad. She fooled us both. But we're going to be okay. We still have each other," he nodded, a faint smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. "I don't deserve your forgiveness, Ava. I let her come between us, and I almost lost you because of it." I took a deep breath, feeling a wave of emotions rise within me. We both made mistakes, but we can rebuild. We can protect what Mom left us together. We spent the rest of the day talking, sharing stories, reconnecting in a way we hadn't in years. It felt like a wall had finally been torn down, allowing us to truly see each other for the first time. The years of distance, mistrust, and pain began to fade, replaced by a renewed sense of closeness, of family. In the weeks that followed, my father and I worked to repair the damage Sophia had caused. We met with financial advisors, secured my inheritance, and made plans for the future. With Mr. Bennett's guidance, we protected our assets, ensuring that the legacy my mother had left would remain safe. It wasn't easy. The memories of Sophia's betrayal lingered, casting shadows over our lives. But we faced those shadows together, drawing strength from each other and from a love that had always been there, even when we had been too blinded to see it. One afternoon, as we strolled through the garden, my father looked at me with a calm but resolved expression. "Your mother would be proud of you, Ava," he said. You stood your ground for yourself, for our family, and preserved her legacy. I'm certain you'll carry it forward with respect." I smiled, feeling a peace I hadn't felt in a long time. "Thank you, Dad." I believe she'd be proud of both of us with Sophia gone. The house felt lighter, free from the tension and deception that had burdened us for so long. I spent more time with my father, learning about our family's history and listening to the stories my grandmother had passed down to him. We found solace in each other and in the bond we had rebuilt through our shared struggle. Ultimately, Sophia's exit symbolized not only the end of one chapter but the beginning of another. I had fought for my inheritance, for my family, and for the legacy my mother had left to me. And though the fight had been difficult, it had taught me valuable lessons about resilience, trust, and the strength that lies within us when we're pushed to the edge. As I stood in the garden one evening, watching the sun set over the home that had sheltered me for so many years, I felt a sense of finality. I was no longer the little girl waiting for her father's return, nor the anxious young woman struggling to protect what was rightfully hers. I had confronted my fears, faced the darkness, and emerged stronger on the other side. My mother's legacy was secure, and I was prepared to carry it forward, knowing I possessed the strength, courage, and support of the family that truly mattered. I took a deep breath, savoring the calm that had finally settled over my life. The storm had passed, and in its place, I had discovered not just peace, but a fresh start. The future was mine, and I was ready to welcome it, confident in my ability to protect all that I held dear. If you enjoyed the story, don't forget to subscribe to hear new stories each day. Let us know what resonated with you most in the comments.